Man, the world loved the Temptations, but the Temptations didn't always love themselves. That's the wild truth, y'all. In the early 1960s, five young guys came together to chase a dream, and one of them was Elbridge Al Bryant. He was there at the very beginning, the spark, the energy, the brother who could light up a stage. But somewhere between the spotlight and the struggle, his name got lost. You see the movie, you hear the legends, but the real story? It's way deeper, way sadder, and way more complicated. Al Bryant wasn't just a footnote, he was a founder. So why did his voice fade into the background? Let's get into his story right now. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Man, before the lights, before Motown, before the world ever shouted the name Temptations, there was just a little boy from Thomasville, Georgia, Elbridge Bryant, born the 28th of September 1939, didn't come into the world with silver spoons or promises of fame. He came up in the Deep South, in a time when segregation was still heavy in the air, when opportunities for young black kids were limited, and when music, especially gospel and rhythm, was one of the few things that could lift your spirit and make you believe tomorrow might be better. You know how some kids find their voice in church? That was Al. Picture him as a young boy, small frame but a big smile, standing in those wooden pews, clapping his hands, and trying to sing louder than the grown folks. The church wasn't just about religion, it was about survival, about community, about hope. For Al, it was the first stage he ever knew, and man, he loved it. He wasn't shy, not even back then. He was the type of kid who'd grab the spotlight if it was open, because deep inside, he already had that spark, that entertainer's itch. As he grew, so did that confidence. He moved up north with his family, landing in Detroit, Michigan. Now Detroit in the late 1950s was buzzing, man. This was the Motor City, the car capital, but also the brewing ground of what would soon become the Motown sound. Imagine being a teenager in Detroit around that time. You could hear doo-wop on every corner, voices harmonizing on streetlights, young groups practicing behind record stores. It was like music was in the air, free to anyone who dared to chase it, and Al was one of those dreamers. By the time he hit high school age, Al wasn't just a choir boy anymore. He was chasing the street corner harmonies, singing with friends, learning how to hold his part in a harmony stack. His voice? Strong, commanding, with a grit that made you listen. He wasn't the smoothest crooner like Eddie Kendricks would become, but he had energy raw, untamed, and full of fire. People noticed him. He had charisma, that stage presence that makes you watch even if the voice ain't perfect. And trust me, his voice was good too. Detroit's black music scene was like a family tree with branches everywhere. You had groups forming, breaking apart, reforming with new names. Out of this chaos came one group called The Distance. And guess who ended up in it? That's right, Al Bryant. The Distance were made up of a bunch of young cats who wanted to be stars. Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, and a few others. They weren't polished yet, but they were hungry. They practiced like crazy, singing at parties, at clubs, wherever somebody would let them perform. And Al fit right in. He had the voice, the moves, and the confidence to step out front when needed. But here's the thing about Al. He wasn't just some background guy. Even in The Distance, he stood out. Folks who saw him perform said he had this contagious energy, like you couldn't ignore him once he hit the stage. He was known for being lively, maybe even a little too lively sometimes. That wild streak? It was already there. Some loved it, some thought it was trouble, but nobody forgot him. When The Distance eventually evolved into a new lineup, the seeds of the Temptations were planted. In 1961, the lineup shifted. Otis Williams, Melvin Franklin, Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, and Elbridge Al Bryant. Man, that's history right there. The original Temptations. Before David Ruffin, before Dennis Edwards, before the world knew their names, this was the crew that set it off. And Al Bryant wasn't just along for the ride, he was one of the architects. Think about that for a second. Every great group has a first lineup, the one that lays the foundation even if it doesn't last forever. That was Al's place in music history. Without him, the sound, the chemistry, the grind of those early years, it just wouldn't have been the same. He was the guy who gave it energy, the guy who could hype a crowd when the group was still struggling to find its identity. And man, those early 1,960 days weren't easy. The Temptations didn't blow up overnight. They had to grind, cutting singles that didn't chart, doing shows in small clubs, opening for bigger acts, waiting for their shot. Al was right there, hustling with them, dreaming of that one big break. You can almost imagine him backstage, laughing, drinking a soda, saying, "We're gonna make it, y'all. Watch." But even in those early days, cracks were starting to show. Al had that wild boy energy that could either light up a room or cause tension in the group. Some said he was unpredictable, maybe not as disciplined as the others. But at the same time, that's what made him unforgettable. He wasn't just singing, he was performing, giving the crowd a show. And sometimes that scared the guys who wanted to play it safe. Still, in those first few years, Al Bryant was a temptation through and through. He was there when the dream was still fragile, when success was far from guaranteed. He carried his share of the load, poured his voice into those early songs, and helped shape what would become one of the greatest groups in soul music history. From Thomasville to Detroit, from church pews to smoky clubs, from a little boy with a loud voice to a young man standing in the founding lineup of the Temptations, that's Elbridge Al Bryant's early life. Man, it's wild to think how far he came before the world even knew his name. Man, by the time 1961 rolled around, the foundation was set. The distance had morphed into something new, something that would soon carry the name The Temptations. And right there, shoulder to shoulder with Otis Williams, Paul Williams, Eddie Kendricks, and Melvin Franklin, was Elbridge Al Bryant. This was the birth of the Classic Five, before history would start swapping faces and rewriting who mattered most. Back then, Motown was like a factory of dreams. Berry Gordy had this vision of turning Detroit into the sound of young America, and he was signing up talent left and right. The Temptations caught his eye early on. They weren't superstars yet, not even close, but you could tell the potential was there. The harmonies were tight, the choreography was slick, and with Al in the mix, they had that extra energy, that spark on stage that could turn heads. Their first single with Motown, "Oh, Mother of Mine," in 1960, didn't burn up the charts. But it was a start. It was proof that they were in the game. Al wasn't the lead on that track, but don't get it twisted, he was part of the engine. His strong background vocals gave the group that depth, that thickness in the harmony. And Live, man, Live was where Al shined. That's the thing with Al. On wax, he might not have been the star every time, but on stage, he was electric. Fans who caught those early shows talk about how he moved, how he smiled, how he made the crowd feel like they were part of the performance. He wasn't just singing his part, he was hyping the whole group. Sometimes he'd grab a lead spot during live sets, taking songs like Check Yourself or Come On, and putting his own stamp on them. And let's be real, not every singer in the group could pull that off. But being in Motown meant you had to compete. You had Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Marvelettes, Mary Wells, all grinding, all hungry. The Temptations needed a hit to stay in the conversation. And while Al was giving it his all, the group struggled to crack the mainstream at first. Single after single dropped without making a huge splash. It was frustrating, man. Imagine working your heart out, perfecting routines, recording all night, and still not seeing your name climb the charts. For Al, though, that didn't stop the hustle. He was all in, running with his brothers, chasing the dream. You can almost see him backstage, towel around his neck, telling the guys, "We just gotta keep pushing. The crowd loves us. The record will come." That was his mindset. He believed in the group, and he believed their time was coming. If the records weren't popping off yet, the stage was where the Temptations proved their worth. And man, that's where Al Bryant really came alive. He wasn't content to just stand in formation and hit the notes he wanted to perform. People who saw the early Tempts live said Al was the one moving the most, cracking smiles, throwing in little extra steps, pulling the crowd in like he was born for that spotlight. In those early Detroit gigs, they'd often do covers of popular tunes, and Al would step up to the mic even if he wasn't the lead on the recording. "I Want a Love I Can See" became one of his live specialties. He and Paul Williams would go back and forth on stage, trading lines like two heavyweights in the ring. Their voices weren't the same. Paul had that smooth, pleading tone, while Al brought the fire, the grit. Together, It was magic. And for the fans who caught it, they never forgot it. That's the underrated piece of Al's story. On the records, Motown producers didn't always hand him the leads. But live, the group leaned on him because he could keep the crowd hyped. He had this fearless energy. Like he didn't care if he was singing to 10 people in a club or 1,000 in a theater, he was going to give it all. Some folks said he was the showman of the early Temptations, the one who could shake up the stage when the routine got too stiff. But with that, fire came friction. Al was a free spirit, and sometimes that clashed with the group's discipline. Motown was all about polished perfect steps, perfect notes, perfect image. Al, he could be unpredictable. One night he'd kill it, have the crowd screaming, and the next he might push too far, adding moves the others weren't ready for. That wild streak made him unforgettable to the audience, but it made things tense inside the group. By 1962 and 1963, the Temptations were still grinding, still chasing that elusive big hit. But the lineup was solid, and the chemistry was undeniable. Al was part of every rehearsal, every long night on the road, every small victory when a crowd clapped louder than expected. He wasn't a side note, he was one of the 5 guys sweating it out to make the Temptations a household name. Quick timeline, on-screen card. Asterisk 1939, Elbridge Bryant is born in Thomasville, Georgia. Asterisk 1960, joins the distance. Asterisk 1961, becomes part of the founding Temptations lineup. Asterisk 1962, records Dream Come True under Motown. Asterisk 1963, group tension rises as success feels just out of reach. Man, from the pews of a small church to being part of Motown's rising stars, Al Bryant's rise was fast, fiery, and unforgettable. But as we'll see, the higher the climb, the sharper the fall. By the early 1960s, the grind was starting to pay off. The Temptations had been hustling hard, long rehearsals, endless gigs, small paychecks, but finally, little sparks of recognition were flickering. In 1962, they dropped Dream Come True, written and produced by Berry Gordy himself. Now, it wasn't a smash hit, but it did something important. It put the Temptations on the map. For the first time, they had a single that made a little noise, just enough to say, hey, these guys might really be something. And you better believe Al Bryant was right there, his voice woven into those early tracks. Even if he wasn't the lead on every recording, his harmonies gave the group that fullness Motown was looking for. Think about it. 5 different voices blending like one instrument, that's what made the Temps special. And Al's part mattered. He carried his weight. But the real magic wasn't just in the studio, it was on stage. Man, when the Temptations performed live in those early Motown reviews, that's where they started turning heads. They'd hit the stage in sharp suits, smooth choreography, smiles locked in place, and then boom, there was Al. He was the wild card, the spark plug. He didn't just follow the routine, he gave it extra juice. He'd shout to the crowd, throw in a move, lean into the mic with that big grin. People remembered him because he made the show feel alive. One of the clearest moments that showed his impact was the live performances of I Want a Love I Can See. On record, Paul Williams had the lead, but on stage, Al would often jump in, trading lines with Paul like they were battling for the spotlight. And honestly, that tension, that back and forth, made the group unforgettable. Fans in the audience got a double dose of soul, Paul's smooth delivery and Al's fiery punch. Together, it felt like the crowd was getting more than their money's worth. But here's the thing about Motown. It was a machine. Berry Gordy wanted perfection, polish, and marketability. And behind the scenes, Al's fiery spirit sometimes clashed with that. He wasn't always the most disciplined. He wanted to sing his way, move his way, live his way. That's not the Motown system. Still, in those early years, his energy was part of what gave the Temps their edge. Without him, those early gigs might not have hit as hard. By 1963, the group was still searching for that breakthrough hit that would send them to the top. They hadn't yet landed their My Girl moment, but they were getting closer. Producers like Smokey Robinson started taking an interest in them. The pieces were coming together. The Temptations were poised for greatness, and Al was still there, still grinding, still believing. And man, This is where the story starts to turn. Because when success is just around the corner, that's when the pressure builds. The group was hungry, the label was demanding, and the fans were expecting. That's when personalities start to clash, when little cracks turn into fractures. Al had given his voice, his energy, his sweat to the Temptations, but as the group edged closer to greatness, his place in the lineup wasn't as secure as it once seemed. Still, let's not forget, without Al Bryant, there is no original Temptations. He was there when it was all just a dream. He stood on those early stages when nobody knew their name. He carried those harmonies, lit up those reviews, and helped set the stage for one of the greatest soul groups in history. That's his breakthrough, not a #1 hit, not a gold record, but the fact that he was part of building the foundation that Motown would turn into a global phenomenon. Man, it's wild. The world was about to fall in love with the Temptations. But for Al Bryant, the spotlight was about to get dimmer. And when the lights go dim in Motown, you either adapt or you get left behind. Now, if you've seen the 1998 TV movie The Temptations, you probably remember the infamous scene. New Year's Eve, the group just finished tearing the stage up, and Paul Williams wants to go back out for an encore. But Al Bryant? He's shown as the one who's tired, grumpy, not feeling it. The group argues, tensions flare, and then bam, Al smashes a bottle over Paul's head. That's the moment in the movie where Al is painted as the troublemaker, the lazy one, the guy who just didn't want to work as hard as the others. And man, that scene stuck. For a lot of viewers, that's all they know about Al Bryant. They don't know the years he put in, the energy he gave, the songs he carried. They just remember the bottle scene. Hollywood has a way of doing that, boiling a whole person down to one dramatic moment. But here's the wild part. The facts don't line up with the film. In Otis Williams' book Temptations, he actually describes the event differently. According to the book, it was Paul who didn't want to go back out for the encore. Paul was exhausted, drained from the performance. Al, on the other hand, was hyped, ready to keep singing. The argument wasn't about Al being lazy, it was about him wanting to push forward when Paul was ready to call it a night. That's the total opposite of what the movie showed. Even fans caught on to this. You can see it in discussions and interviews, people saying, wait a second, wasn't it Paul who didn't want to go back out? Some die-hard Temptations fans even cite other books, like Tony Turner's Deliver Us from Temptation, which also points out that the TV version twisted events. So why flip the script? Why take Al, a founding member, and cast him as the weak link? Some say it made for better drama in the movie. Others believe it was part of the way Motown and certain voices in the group chose to remember history. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yeah, Al had his struggles. He liked to drink. He could be unpredictable, and he didn't always follow the Motown playbook. But to say he didn't want to perform, that just doesn't add up with the guy fans remembered from those fiery live shows. And the bottle? Well, yeah, that did happen. There was a fight, there was tension, and Al did swing. But when you strip away the context, when you erase the grind he put in and only show that one ugly moment, you miss the full picture. You miss the human being behind the headline. That's why fact-checking matters, man. Movies are powerful, but they're not always accurate. They give you drama, not always truth. For Al Bryant, the movie left a scar on his reputation. For some people, that's the only image they'll ever have of him, the tired, bitter guy who couldn't cut it. But the facts? They tell us Al was fiery, passionate, and maybe too wild for the Motown system, but never lazy. So here's the question for y'all. Do you believe the movie version, or do you trust the written accounts from those who were actually there? Was Al really the weak link, or was he just a misunderstood founding member caught in a bad moment? Either way, that clash backstage marked the beginning of the end for Al's time with the Temptations. The group was on the brink of success. Motown was ready to push them harder than ever, and Al's place in the lineup was slipping. The film might tell it one way, but the truth? Man, it's way more complicated than a 2-minute scene. Man, if the early 1960 was all about grinding and chasing the dream, the middle of the decade was when things started to crack. The Temptations were on the edge of something huge, but behind the curtain, tensions were bubbling. And right in the middle of it all was Al Bryant. Here's the truth. Al wasn't built for the Motown system. Berry Gordy ran Motown like an assembly line. You had to look sharp, act sharp, sing sharp, no slip-ups allowed. Rehearsals went on for hours. Choreography had to be exact, down to the tilt of your head and the snap of your fingers. For some guys, that discipline was fine. For Al, it clashed with his free spirit. He was a wild boy, man. He wanted to sing with fire, move with instinct, live in the moment, and in Motown, that kind of unpredictability could get you in trouble real quick. The bottle incident was the turning point. After that night, trust inside the group was shaken. Otis Williams and the others felt like Al was becoming too volatile. Motown executives didn't like drama. To them, every slip was a threat to the brand they were building. Slowly but surely, the writing was on the wall. Al's days in the group were numbered. By late 1963, the Temptations made the hardest call they let him go. Imagine that, man. You help build something from scratch, sweat through the tough nights, sing your lungs out when nobody even knows your name, and then just like that, you're out. The group was moving forward, but Al was left behind. That had to sting, deeply. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing a brotherhood, a dream, a chance to stand on the mountaintop with the guys he started with. And while the Temptations went on to add David Ruffin and start climbing the charts, Al had to watch from the outside. Imagine seeing your old group on TV, hearing the applause, knowing you were once a part of that magic. That pain, it's hard to put into words. There's a story some fans talk about how Al was once spotted at a bar, drinking, watching the Temptations perform on television. The look on his face, they say, told the whole story. Pride, maybe, but also regret. He was happy for them, but broken inside, because deep down, he probably knew that could have been him. After leaving the group, Al tried to find his footing. He sang in smaller clubs, did a few gigs here and there, but it was never the same. The machine of Motown had rolled on without him, and once you were out, man, it was nearly impossible to climb back in. He didn't have Berry Gordy behind him anymore. He didn't have the Motown machine polishing his image. He was just Al, the guy who used to be in the Temptations. And that's the cruel part of the music game. One day you're on the stage with the hottest group in the city, the next day you're just another name people whisper about, hey, wasn't he in the Temptations once? That's how fast it changes. But let's keep it real. Al wasn't blameless. He had a temper. He liked to drink. That energy that made him great on stage sometimes made him reckless off it. The same fire that drew fans in could burn bridges behind the scenes. Still, it doesn't erase what he gave. He was there at the beginning, and without him the Temptations' foundation isn't the same. By the mid-1960, Al's life was already on a different track. The Temptations were climbing to superstardom, and Al Bryant was slipping into the shadows. The dream he had chased since Thomasville was slipping away, replaced by bitterness, booze, and the slow realization that history wasn't going to remember him the way it remembered the others. Man, that's a hard pill to swallow. To give so much, and then feel forgotten. That's the tragedy of Al Bryant's downfall. It didn't happen in one night. It was a slow fade, a slow breaking of a dream, and he never really found his way back. After the split in 1963, Al Bryant's life never quite found steady ground again. The Temptations replaced him with David Ruffin, and the group soared. My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I Wish It Would Rain, these songs turned the Temptations into legends. But Al, he became a ghost in the story, a name rarely mentioned. And man, imagine how that felt. To watch the dream you helped build finally break through but with someone else holding your spot. That kind of heartbreak can eat at you. Al tried to stay in music. There were whispers that he hooked up with local groups, even rumors about him singing with the Dramatics at one point. But nothing concrete ever stuck. Without Motown, without the machine, his career drifted. He'd pop up here and there in small clubs, but it wasn't the same. No suits, no screaming fans, no big lights, just dim rooms and fading applause. And slowly, the weight of it all began to drag him down. Al turned heavier to the bottle. Drinking had always been part of his life, but now it became more than just a bad habit. It was comfort, escape, and destruction all rolled into one. Friends would say he still had the charm, still had the energy when he wanted to, but the fire was dimmer, the focus gone. The sad truth is that Al's story after Temptations is mostly silence. History didn't keep records of his every move. There aren't stacks of interviews or documentaries about where he went and what he did. He was a man living in the shadows of the biggest soul group in history. And the shadows, man, they were heavy. By the early 1970s, Al's health was slipping. Years of drinking caught up fast. He was only in his early 30s, but already his body was breaking down. The wild boy energy that once lit up stages was now tearing him apart inside. Liver disease, complications, just the toll of too much too soon. And then came the end, the 26th of October, 1975. Al Bryant died in Florida, just 36 years old. 36, man. That's barely enough time to live a full life, let alone build a legacy. The official reports point to liver failure brought on by alcoholism. A slow, painful fade-out for a man who once sang with joy, with power, with dreams bigger than himself. Think about that 36 years old. While his old bandmates were still touring, still making hits, Al's story was already closed. No big tributes, no Motown honors, no grand farewell. Just a short obituary, a memory carried by a few, and silence. That's how forgotten he had become. But to the ones who knew him, the ones who saw him in those early years, Al wasn't just a footnote. He was the guy with the smile, the one who could wake up a crowd, the one who believed in the dream when it was still just smoke. His downfall doesn't erase that. His struggles don't cancel his contribution. They just remind us how fragile this game really is. And man, it's wild to think about the contrast. The Temptations went on to become icons, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, countless awards, tours around the world. Al Bryant, the original spark, was buried in relative obscurity. No grand stage, no Hollywood ending, just a young man gone too soon, with a story most people never hear. That's why we tell it now. Because Elbridge Al Bryant was more than the bottle scene in a movie. He was more than a troubled footnote. He was a founding temptation, a soul who gave his all and paid the price. His conflict and downfall are tragic, but his role in the story, undeniable. When you talk about legacy, man, it's easy to get blinded by the big hits. Everybody remembers My Girl. Everybody remembers David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams. But rewind the tape just a little further, and you'll find Al Bryant's fingerprints all over the foundation of the Temptations. Songs like I Want a Love I Can See still carry his presence. That track, produced by Smokey Robinson in 1963, was one of the group's first real classics, and you can hear Al loud and clear. He gave it grit, power, and a punch that balanced Paul Williams' smooth delivery. To this day, die-hard fans point to that song as proof that Al wasn't just some replaceable extra, he was a voice that mattered. And let's not forget the energy he brought to the stage. Even though the records didn't always highlight him, fans who saw the group live never forgot how Al lit up the room. He was the spark plug, the one who could make the crowd scream even before the group had their signature hits. That kind of charisma doesn't just disappear, it leaves an imprint on the people who experienced it. It's also important to remember how much of the Temptations' identity was shaped in those early years. The polished routines, the harmonies, the idea that a group could be more than just singers, they were entertainers. And Al was a big part of that evolution. His liveliness pushed the group to be more than statues in suits. He made them performers, and that DNA carried on even after he was gone. Fans who dig deep into Motown history often bring up Al Bryant in conversations about underrated voices. He's a reminder that not every contribution gets celebrated, not every pioneer gets their flowers. Sometimes the first to build the house don't get to live in it, but without them, there's no house at all. That's Al's legacy. He may not have been there when the Temptations hit #1, but he was there when the group was nothing. He put in the grind, he set the tone, he poured his soul into the dream. And if you ask the real fans, the ones who know the story beyond the movie, they'll tell you, Al Bryant deserves respect. Man, legacy isn't just about hits on the chart. It's about who helped make the hits possible in the first place. And Elbridge Al Bryant, he was one of those guys. Here's the crazy twist in Al Bryant's legacy. By leaving or being forced out, he indirectly helped create what fans now call the Classic Five. When David Ruffin stepped in to replace him, the Temptations finally hit that unstoppable stride. Ruffin's gritty leads, combined with Eddie Kendricks' falsetto, Paul Williams' smooth tone, Melvin Franklin's deep bass, and Otis Williams' steady presence, that lineup became legendary. But let's not forget what came before it. Without Al, there's no foundation for Ruffin to build on. Without Al sweating through those early Motown reviews, without his voice anchoring those first singles, the group doesn't survive long enough to reach that classic era. It's the uncomfortable truth. Al's exit gave the Temptations their iconic lineup, but his years of work are what made the transition possible in the first place. And that raises the bigger question, does history treat Al fairly? For many casual fans, the answer is no. They don't even know his name. They know Ruffin, Kendricks, Paul, Melvin, and Otis. But Al Bryant? For too many, he's just the guy before Ruffin. That's not fair, man. That's not justice for someone who was part of building the dream from the ground up. The thing about legacy is that it isn't always about fame, it's about recognition. Al's story has become a cautionary tale in the music industry, a reminder of how talent can be overlooked, how the narrative can be shaped by whoever tells it loudest. The movie painted him one way, the book's another, the fans still debate, but through it all, the truth remains. Al Bryant was a temptation, a founder, a pioneer. And if you really think about it, his spirit never left the group. That fiery stage energy, you see echoes of it in Ruffin's raw passion. That willingness to hype the crowd, you can trace it through every Temptations lineup that followed. Even after he was gone, pieces of Al lived on in the DNA of the group. So maybe Al's legacy isn't just in the songs he sang or the shows he performed. Maybe it's in the reminder that history doesn't always celebrate everyone equally, but that doesn't mean their impact wasn't real. Maybe it's in the lesson that you can be underrated and still unforgettable. Elbridge Al Bryant didn't get the flowers he deserved. But when we look back now, when we tell his story with truth and respect, we give him something Motown and history didn't recognition. The world loved the Temptations, but the Temptations didn't love themselves. That line hits harder now, doesn't it? Because when you look at the story of Elbridge Al Bryant, you see all the joy and pain wrapped up in one man's journey. He was there at the start. He poured his heart into the dream, and yet history almost forgot him. Think about it. Al was part of the original lineup, sweating it out when nobody cared, singing those first singles that barely cracked the charts, hyping crowds in smoky Detroit clubs. He believed in the vision when it was still just a vision. Without that faith, without that fire, maybe the Temptations never even make it to the point where Smokey Robinson writes them a hit. But when the success finally came, Al wasn't there to taste it. He was on the outside watching his brothers turn into legends while his own name faded. Man, that's heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, was he really the problem the movie painted him to be? Or was he just a man whose style didn't fit the Motown machine? The truth is, Al had flaws. He drank too much, he had a temper, and he didn't always play by the rules. But isn't that the story of so many great artists? The same fire that makes them shine can also burn them out. Al was no different. Still, when you strip away the drama and the myths, what you're left with is a young man who died too soon, 36 years old. That's barely halfway through life. We'll never know what else he could have done, what kind of music he might have made if he'd had the right support, the right timing, the right breaks. What we do know is that he helped create one of the most iconic groups in music history, and that alone should earn him respect. This is why Celebrity Underrated exists, man. To tell stories like Al's, to shine light on the names that get left in the shadows. Because the industry doesn't always hand out flowers to everyone who deserves them. Sometimes you have to go back, dig into the past, and remind the world that these artists mattered, and Al Bryant mattered. So what do we do with his story? Do we remember him as the troublemaker who swung a bottle, or do we remember him as the spark who helped light the Temptations' flame? Maybe the answer is both. Maybe the truth lives somewhere in between. But what's certain is that Al Bryant was more than a footnote. He was a founding Temptation, a man who gave his voice and his energy to a dream that outlived him. Man, if there's one takeaway here, it's this. Don't let the official version of history be the only version. Question it, dig deeper, and give credit where it's due. Because underrated doesn't mean unimportant, it just means unseen. And Al deserves to be seen. So I'll leave you with this question. Should Al Bryant be remembered as the troublemaker who couldn't keep up, or as the heartbeat that helped start one of the greatest soul groups of all time? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's give this brother the recognition he never got in his lifetime. And as always, if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and stay tuned, because there are so many more underrated legends whose stories deserve to be told. Rest in peace, Elbridge Al Bryant. Gone too soon, but never forgotten.